In January of 1957, the newly formed Public Relations Office organized a very successful 3-day water carnival in the park, organized by Eric Handberry, the public relations officer. This was so successful that it encouraged Handberry to try and organize another event that was bigger and better. To do this, he realized he needed a bigger venue. He was shown an untidy swampy gully in Brooklands, which had a few cattle grazing on it. He immediately saw its potential, comparing it to the Hollywood Bowl at Los Angeles. Following is video footage from Malcolm McAlpine, accompanied by extracts from an article written by Eric Handberry, which tells the story of the bowl's development in 1957 and 1958, culminating with the first Festival of the Pines in February 1958.
My story begins on June 11, 1957, when the public first became aware of the plans to construct an open-air theatre in New Plymouth. On that day, the Taranaki Herald reported a meeting to be held between the Puckakura Park Committee and the New Plymouth Public Relations Office. The news item was accompanied by a photograph of the suggested venue, a waste area situated between Puckakura Park and Brooklands, and was considered to be of sufficient importance to merit 5 columns of front-page space. The meeting with the park committee, if not so enthusiastic, was at least successful, and armed with the support of the members, we opened our office on Wednesday, June 12, with the new responsibility of building New Zealand's largest open-air theatre. We had on that day a £485 credit balance at the bank. Finally, on August 17, the first work started on the newly named Bowl of Brooklands. To form the first slopes of the auditorium, 2 earth-moving contractors had offered their equipment, and it was heartening, and at times frightening in its inevitability, to see the enormous machines roaring and grunting as they pushed the black earth of the slopes into the almost swamp-like center of the bowl. The site for the stage had been fixed at a semicircular projection from the opposite lake edge, directly facing the auditorium, and work commenced clearing the tangled growth of ponga stumps and coarse grass that had accumulated over many years of neglect. Inaccessible to heavy machinery, it was hard, back-breaking work, slow to show effect. Meanwhile, a party of voluntary workers had begun to cart away, by wheelbarrow, a small island that lay between the stage and the audience, the start of a job that took 6 men 2 months to complete, and one that became increasingly more tedious as the weeks rolled by. The operation was not without a certain unkind humor, particularly when an out-of-control wheelbarrow would tip its contents, and more often than not, its man, into the stinking mud of the emptied lake. The use of a tractor on the bank to tow the wheelbarrows made the work shorter, if not more hazardous, and October saw the end of the island, and the hard-packed earth where once it stood was being used as the foundations for the first footlights. The flat area for the stage had been formed, and the Junior Chamber of Commerce, who sent many parties to assist, were at last starting work on the focal point of our endeavors, the massive concrete stage planned for 2,400 square feet of acting area. The rain, which had seemed to fall incessantly over the last few weeks, made way for sunshine, and we worked ahead more quickly. It was at this time that the working committee came into being, formed by necessity, and to our everlasting good fortune it comprised John Sutherland, architect; Robin Sinclair, architect; Malcolm McAlpine, mill owner; Malcolm Gaze, service manager; Joe Carey, carpenter; Marie Carey, and Rona Seeger. This was the first recognition of the small group who had carried on, even when the voluntary response and enthusiasm has fallen to almost nil. During this time, they had continued with the construction of the main concrete stage, and by December 31, it was almost complete. The design and construction was overseen by Malcolm Lay, a New Plymouth builder, and it was only his ingenuity and experience that made it possible for such small numbers of comparatively unskilled workers to complete this tremendous undertaking. We were now ready for the soundshell and seating. The prospect of building 4,500 seats, by voluntary labor, can be absolutely overwhelming, unless you keep in the forefront of your mind the thought of 4,500 5-shilling bottoms sitting on them. It was only this thought that provided the driving force to complete this enormous task. The seat design was intended to reduce the work to a minimum. They were nothing more than rough forms. Planks 12 feet long were raised from the ground, on stakes driven into the ground, and so placed that the seats would form a great semicircular auditorium, each facing the stage. The great arch that was to support the soundshell had quickly passed through the designing stage, and work started on its construction. All the wood used had been donated by Cleland's, a New Plymouth building firm, and the Union Construction Company had agreed to shape the different members, under Robin's supervision. Each half was built separately on top of the newly laid concrete stage, and had the appearance of a slightly curved truss. Robin was particularly exacting during the prefabrication of the two halves, and for the most part, was happier to assemble it himself, rather than accept the dubious assistance of unskilled voluntary labor. His concern was understandable, in view of the obvious necessity for exactness in the workmanship, the final criterion in its construction being whether or not the bolt holes in the peak of each half would meet when they were hoisted into position. At last, after weeks of shaping, drilling, bolting, and a fair amount of cursing, the two sides were completed and lay taking up most of the stage area, ready for the erection. To save time later, we had painted them on the ground, bringing a touch of gaiety for the first time to the dull monotony of the vast grey stage. Robin had suggested that at least 20 men would be required to erect the arch. Ropes were to be attached to the peak of each half, and after the bases had been secured, hoisted like giant cross scimitars, until only the points touched. The operation would, he said, become increasingly more delicate as the two sides became higher. We would at that time have less control over the tendency of each member to fall sideways, and greater surveillance would be required on the guys. Along with this, most of the weight of the arch would be transferred to the bases, and an undisciplined enthusiasm amongst the men pulling might very well mean that the arch could be pulled too far to fall unrestrained the other way. The same feeling of inevitability that had alarmed me when the bulldozers first started on the auditorium assailed me again, and for a while, the magnitude of this vast project belittled my optimism. The soundshell arch was erected on Saturday, January 25, 4 weeks before the festival started. Luckily, 25 voluntary workers were available on that weekend, and apart from minor troubles, the vast structure went ahead quickly. The arch had been fitted with immense metal feet in the shape of a semicircle, in which a hole had been drilled to allow a pin to go through. It was on this pin that the whole weight of the arch and a great part of the cantilevered shell was supported. It also served to anchor the front opening of the structure at points where enormous concrete blocks had been poured into the ground, and on which the great arch would pivot as it was pulled by ropes into an upright position. Unluckily, the shape of the corresponding shoe, bolted to the concrete block, made it necessary for each half of the arch to be lifted about 8 feet from the floor before the pin could be inserted. It was while we were lifting one of these that the foot slipped just as we had reached the correct height, and the 37-feet-long structure crashed to the ground. Miraculously, no one was injured, but the incident drew a marked attention to the danger of operations, and we approached the undertaking with increased apprehension. Even when the arch was firmly pivoted, it required considerable courage to work below, before the two halves were joined, due to the deceiving frailty of the wooden structure. Each half would whip and perceptibly sag at every pull of the hoisting ropes. Robin had taken his self-imposed place at the very top of the scaffold, and from this precarious position he directed the entire operation. As the two halves reached their maximum elevation, the work became increasingly more hazardous, and from my comparatively safe place on the stage I felt sick with the responsibility. The control of the team's hoisting became now more precise as the weight of the structure was transferred to the pivoted bases, and, unwilling as we were to reduce the number of men on each rope, our difficulty lay in restraining their eagerness. Inch by inch the towering members crept upwards, as the working committee cursed, and cajoled the teams into the desired effort, until, quite unexpectedly, the crossed arches parted, quivering and swaying a little beyond the maximum height. Under Robin's instructions, we began to lower each towards the other, to bring, we hoped, the bolt holes in line. At a word from Robin we stopped, and I can remember now, as clearly as though it were yesterday, the picture of 20 quiet tense men, straining to the ropes, and the sound of the hammers driving the bolts home. It is a moment I shall never forget, a moment of exquisite relief and overwhelming triumph. With the arch in position, and soaring above our work on the stage, we commenced work immediately on the rear wall and cantilever roof of the sound shell itself. Winston's had not only made the scaffolding available, but Errol Thompson, who erected for them, had also agreed to assist us during the weekends. With his invaluable experience, the framework grew quickly, and before long 3 supports for the roof were projected from the back wall to embrace the upper curve of the arch, and point to the sky, 40-odd feet above the front edge of the stage. We had been fortunate enough to tender successfully for 4 tons of sheet tin steel, at £50, from NZ Railways, and with this we covered the huge baffle boards that were to form the back wall and the roof. 2 weeks before the festival we began hoisting these into position with block and tackle. Malcolm McAlpine did some marvellous work here, a head for heights, and sheer fitness being absolutely necessary to work with confidence amongst the network of scaffolding that sagged and quivered alarmingly with every pull of the hoisting ropes. Behind the scenes the building was crude, our workmanship raw, a building held together with almost nothing more than high hopes and an interlaced mass of scaffolding and number 8 wire. Toilets, like military police, are a necessary evil, and our attitude to this part of the construction was given less attention than was due to it. The building was commenced at the last moment, when all available materials had been exhausted and with the chances of begging more, somewhat limited. As in many other such difficulties, however, the firm of C.C. Wards Limited came to our assistance, and provided us with an enormous pile of dismantled cases. It was from these poor materials alone, with the last of our 4x3s, that the inaugural toilets of Brooklands were built. These problems were increased in our case by the very limitations of our materials, and our abysmal ignorance of the refinements required in the feminine precincts of our toilet block. We designed, for instance, the ladies, without doors, in the mistaken opinion that women had the same companionable instincts as men have at such times, and after receiving many complaints from irate users, we had the bother of hanging curtains over the entrance to each bay. The sound shed is situated on the left-hand side of the bowl, and is so placed that from the window of the shed you can obtain an uninterrupted view of the stage across the lake. The weatherboards are of timber donated by the New Plymouth Savings Bank, aged and unfortunately decrepit. The foundation timbers were obtained from the same source, but in this case they were salvaged from materials used in the first-story floor joists of the old bank building. Running the full length of the front wall, we had fitted a narrow opening approximately 2 feet deep, covered by a hinged flap, and through which the sound technicians could both hear and see a show in progress, and make the requisite control to the sound system as required.
The festival got underway on Tuesday the 25th of February 1958, with the running of the festival games at the Puckakura Park Sports Ground. The legendary Murray Halberg was supposed to be the star attraction but unfortunately could not make it. The games were a success, bringing in a crowd of 2,000 spectators. One notable competitor was a young Alan Jelliman who became assistant curator of Puckakura Park in 1962, beginning a distinguished career in horticulture. Nights 2 and 3 of the festival saw the production of George Bernard Shaw's Androcles and the Lion on the Brooklands stage. The play was produced by Mrs. Nita Neal MBE, who came up from Christchurch. All the players, however, were local amateurs. The stage was designed by Frank Tett, drawing master at the Boys' High School. 7,000 spectators saw the play over the 2 nights. Friday the 28th of February was a variety night, which drew a crowd of over 7,000. The star of the show was Irish tenor Patrick O'Hagan. There were also many local performers, including the New Plymouth Girls' Choir. Saturday night was advertised as a festival concert, which was attended by the Governor-General Viscount Cobham and his wife. It attracted a crowd of 12,000 people. Mary Ledbetter was proclaimed the first Miss Brooklands. The highlight of the entertainment was a performance by the Wellington Ballet Company, and a sound and light show created by Eric Handberry and Murray Hewson. The Sunday evening proceedings was titled, Festival Act of Worship. About 3,000 people attended. The climax of the evening was a festival hymn, written and composed by the Reverend Kenneth Liggett. The last 2 nights of the Festival of the Pines, Monday 2nd of March, and Tuesday, March 3rd, were reserved for the National Orchestra. Approximately 11,000 people attended over the 2 nights. One of the highlights was the playing of Tchaikovsky's 1812 Overture, with the sound of cannons being simulated by shooting a double-barreled gun into an empty tank. With the profits exceeding £1,600, the festival was deemed a huge success. The sound shell was a temporary structure, and plans to build a permanent one, in time for a festival in 1959, started immediately.